joined now by the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It's Senator Bob Menendez. So, Senator, let's start with the issue of this idea. You've called it the mother of all sanctions bills. At the end of the day, if the Europeans are not aligned with the United States in how to deal with Putin, are we stuck basically in a position of weakness comparatively?
Well, Chuck, it's always better to have multilateral efforts, including multilateral sanctions. And I do believe that there is a difference between the posturing of what some in Europe think might provoke Putin versus, at the end of the day, the response if Putin does make the mistake of invading Ukraine. I think the response will be strong and swift. But ultimately, we have the wherewithal in the sanctions bill that I've authored and in the negotiations we're having with Republicans to come together on a different components to speak with one voice and send a very clear message that, in fact, we stand with Ukraine and there will be severe consequences to invoke those severe consequences unilaterally. And we have seen from the Iran experience that when we do that, other countries and their companies will shy away from engaging, in this case it would be Russia, because of the secondary nature of those sanctions.
Let me ask you this. If Tony Blinken says this can be resolved diplomatically, how is this resolved diplomatically without rewarding Putin for his aggression at the border of Ukraine? Well,
you can ultimately have a diplomatic solution that respects Ukraine's territorial sovereignty and independence, as well as the neighbors in the Baltic and others, and ensure their ultimate security and freedom. By the same time, if Russia believes that there are actions being taken that they consider undermine their security, there are commitments that can be made as it relates to security guarantees. Now, that's not about not extending NATO. That's not about withdrawing from the Baltic. That's not about deciding Ukraine's future in NATO. But there are other elements of agreements that can be arrived if at the end that is the true concern of Putin. And only Putin knows that. But with 100,000 plus troops, I was listening to the report of Richard saying that there isn't uneasiness in Kiev. I know that President Zelensky wants to keep the population calm, but I also think he needs to keep them informed. There's a reason there's 100,000 troops. Right. And that is more. That is either you are pressuring the West to get some concessions or you intend to have some form of an invasion.
Let me ask you about the timing of your sanctions bill. Alexander Vindman, who I'm going to have on the show at the end of the hour, he wrote an extensive piece in Foreign Policy, and he talked about your bill, calls it a very strong bill, and said it really needs to have strong bipartisan support in order, to send the message Putin thinks that our divided politics is something he can take advantage of. Is this bill going to be passed and signed into law, basically ready to go before Putin acts? Or are you going to be stuck having to pass this in a reactionary stance?
Well, it is my hope that it's before Putin acts. Now, we're not in session this coming week, but we are working as we speak with various Republican colleagues who have their ideas as to how do we deter Putin. We're looking to amalgamate them into the legislation that I sponsor, which is being introduced today by Chairman Meeks in the House of Representatives, so it will be bicameral as well. And we want a strong bipartisan effort. And it is my hope that what we'll do is we'll have a negotiation that we can announce and then move towards a vote when we return. And hopefully a week is not the time frame in which Putin decides to invade. But in any event, he should understand that there is overwhelming bipartisan support for Ukraine in the Congress. It is strong. It's a question of whether or not you make it even stronger, whether or not you make sanctions even quicker. But at the end of the day, there is no lack of resolve, and that much Putin should know.
You're the ranking member, Jim Risch, Republican senator from Idaho. How much are you going to incorporate? He'd like some things added to your bill. How much you plan on incorporating?
Well, we're in discussions with Ranking Member Risch. We're in discussions. Senator Cornyn has an idea of a Lend-Lease program on weapons, even though the administration has already advanced over $600 million to Ukraine. And very recently, this week, authorized the transfer of American-made weapons from the Baltic states to Ukraine, including Javelin missiles that can stop tanks, and other efforts that are being taken place by our allies. So, but that can be a good effort. Senator Rubio has some ideas. Senator Graham has some ideas. I believe there are good ideas in all of them. And we can, I think, bring it together in a common cause, because there is a common spirit to stand behind Ukraine and send an unequivocal message to Putin.
Let me ask one last question to you. It has to do with the Olympics. We have a diplomatic boycott of China. What kind of protections, what are we doing to basically make sure our athletes don't get stuck in China, maybe because of draconian COVID protocols or things like that? If there's a diplomatic boycott, what is the role of the U.S. government to make sure our citizens as citizen athletes there aren't harassed?
Well, a diplomatic boycott means we're not sending officials of the United States government to the Olympics, but we still have a presence in China. We still have an embassy. We still have a full engagement, and we will work to protect any citizen who ultimately either harassed or, God forbid, detained by the Chinese. The Chinese know that. And the world's worst thing for the Chinese in the midst of already a rather negative Olympics in terms of their standing in the world, what they're doing to Uyghurs in concentration camps, and their violations of human rights, and in Hong Kong, the threats to Taiwan. The last thing they need is to detain American Olympians.
I think we all hope you're right about that one. Senator Menendez, Democrat from New Jersey, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. Appreciate you coming on, sharing your perspective with us.
Good to be with you.